Okay, my name's Nadia, and essentially I'm here as part of the coordinator of Resistors Reading Group, and essentially we are a decolonial education initiative, and I'm pleased that a mutual friend here is actually currently in London, so we thought we'd engage in questions relating to decolonization. Rather, the questions will be framed around the idea of anti-colonialism versus decolonization. So, Klee Benally and Princess Benally are both indigenous Diné, more commonly known as Navajo, from the so-called US. Thank you for being here with me today. So in these kinds of conversations, sometimes we jump to politics rather than directly talking about struggle and resistance and liberation in a sort of like more practical manner. But for people that don't know you or the Diné, what does a Diné traditionally, or Diné as a people, orient themselves to the world in terms of how they see and engage with it? And also, since obviously you're not struggling for reform or really any of the values or structures put in place by your dominator or colonizer, I guess what does it mean to be Diné, or what is it to be Diné? And I was also told after you introduced yourself, could you explain why you introduce yourself that way? Like, what are the underlying values there?
Yate she Klee dash Jeanette toward change Shabashin Akudin Dashnella Shema a Beathachi Auto Beathachi dash Che Tithjinde Nasha Auto Kifana Shihawan. So my name is Klee Benally. I'm originally from Black Mesa on the Diné or Navajo Nation. Currently I reside in Flagstaff. Introduce myself in a traditional manner with my clans, and I'll maybe pass it, then we'll respond to your questions.
Princess Benally Yanashia, but Ahni Nishlin Tachini Bashichin, Pilagana Dashiche, Dotsinsakagni Dashinella. I'm originally from Shiprock area, which is in New Mexico, right next to Arizona. So, and we live in Flagstaff. So.
Yeah, so Diné, or Navajo people as we're more commonly known as, traditionally introduce ourselves in this manner with our clans because we have a system called Ke, which is our extended clanship or our familyship, which we have many clans. There's 4 original clans. It connects us to our traditional history, so our ancestry. It also connects us culturally through systems of adoption and integration with a range of other indigenous nations and peoples that we've come into contact with. For example, we have a clan that's it's called Nakudine, which means the wandering people, but some people also call it the Mexican clan as well. So that you meet somebody who's Mexican, you sort of can identify them. If somebody's born from their mother or their father and so forth into that, then that's how they identify. So there's an interesting history in relation to colonial contact and invasion, but also with our traditional people. But the Diné people are matrilineal and matriarchal. And so the clan is passed through the mother's side as well. So when I introduced myself, I introduced also on my mother's side, I'm Russian Polish actually, so I'm a little bit mixed culture, I guess, on that level. And so I introduced my father's side, which is Bitterwater, which I'm born for, and then on his side, grandparents' side, I'm the wandering people as well.
And sort of going back to your question, it's a lot of Diné culture revolves around matrilineal society. So the women are the sort of like the anchors to our culture.
And also, our clan system has provided a means for us to endure extreme challenges and hardships through colonization, particularly in 1860s. The U.S., well, actually in the mid-1500s is the first engagement with Spanish invaders in our areas, and we resisted their attempts to colonize and dominate our area for 350 years. And then in the 1840s, the U.S. tried to invade our lands, and subsequently they had really exacted a refined, if you will, process of colonization and extreme violence. They led under the authority of a general by the name of Kit Carson, or Colonel Kit Carson, they led a scorched earth campaign where they just burned everything, crops, houses, indiscriminately, livestock, indiscriminately killed, whoever, non-combatants in that case, and then subjugated our people, forced us into 8,000 of our people, which was a substantial amount of our nation at that time, to a walk called the Long Walk, hundreds of miles to an area outside of our ancestral homelands, into a concentration camp that we were kept there for 4 years, called Fort Sumner, far off in what is now known as New Mexico. But the important part of that story is that our KEP, or our clan system, ensured that nobody was homeless. Like if there were elders or their families were decimated, and there was just children left alone, when they knew their clan, they identified themselves, their family would take them in, and when we meet somebody who is the same clan from our mother's side or father's side, because we introduce our 4 clans, we don't identify as, oh, you're a cousin. We identify directly as, oh, you're my sister, oh, you're my brother, or you're my child. I can meet a little 5-year-old child. If they're my on my father's side clan, they can be my dad, or they can and so forth. So that's how we're treated, actually, traditionally. But of course, with colonization, that's fragmented to some degree, but it's still in effect. It's very much practiced today, contemporarily. We don't, of course, we don't marry within our clans and so forth. So it's a strong social or mechanism for social cohesion, but it really strengthens the bond that we have, and it has provided means for us to survive, and endure extreme violence under colonialism.
That's really interesting. Do you want to add anything else?
I think Klee, and just sort of what I said earlier, just sort of covers a lot of like the core and the foundation of what Navajo or Diné culture is all about.
Okay, so the next question is, so in today's struggle, what is the difference between anti-colonialism and decolonization politically or in practice? And a mutual friend of ours, Anthony, said that there's definitely a tension here in the so-called Americas. So how would you...
Well, actually, I'm curious as to, like, in your resistance decolonization group, I'm curious as to how you identify decolonization in the context of like this evil empire.
Yeah.
Especially from the Muslim diaspora, if you will. So.
Well, our group is very wide, and we didn't limit it to only a Muslim diaspora. Rather, we invite people who are willing to engage critically and respectfully with the question of decolonization and what it means. So for me, I would say a really broad thing would be kind of reversing the violence of the colonizer. So in my country, sort of in terms of the nation state, I'm mixed ethnically, but in terms of nation state is Pakistan. And the birth of Pakistan itself has a very sort of, it has a very brutal history. Or rather, you could say Pakistan was once India, wasn't it? So if you look at kind of the colonial history with respect to India, but rather Pakistan wasn't once India. That's quite an ignorant thing to say, because Pakistan is a combination of different princely states, a kind of borderline Afghanistan, and it's also was once a huge segment of it. Punjab was once was once India. So it's very like fragmented nation state, and I don't really recognize as Muslims. Rather, the common kind of decolonial perspective would be that we don't necessarily recognize borders, but obviously it'd be quite similar to say how, from what I've been exposed to, how a lot of indigenous South Americans would identify the idea that they would identify themselves as like a united indigenous group. For Muslims, it's quite a complex dialogue. For me as a South Asian, I would say that my, in terms of decolonization of South Asia itself, Muslim or non-Muslim, if I was to engage it as just a South Asian, I would say that obviously we fight on the front of, on two fronts. One front is obviously the violence that was inflicted on our ethnic people during colonial times, the division that it caused, because it caused a lot of ethnic tensions, and then later on what you had was like civil war and things like that in Afghanistan as well, and things. And then as a Muslim, however, decolonization, what it means to me as a Muslim, in contemporary understanding, would mean the fact that we don't recognize borders wherever we are. So I feel for my brothers and sisters in Palestine, I feel for my brothers and sisters in Burma, so it's just, or even in Sudan and so on and so forth. So it's like very much we have a connection, and that connection is our ideology. So it's like our ideology, I believe, is inherently decolonial ideology, because essentially although I'm not saying and I'm not denying that certain ethnic groups within who define themselves as Muslim haven't been, themselves appropriated sort of like behaviors of the colonizers and so on. So you've got like certain Arab, sort of projects within nation states, how they kind of like, their influence in Africa per se and so on. But this is a discussion, I guess, that we can reserve at a reading group. There's quite a
the reason I asked that is because we're facing resource colonialism, we're facing settler colonialism, and these are two operating practices that are hand in hand. But the trend, this sort of decolonial fetishism is just like, you can look on fucking social media or Twitter and see like, hashtag decolonize your diet, and so people are doing personal projects where like, oh, I'm doing this gardening and I'm using heirloom seeds, eating, sort of locally or regionally sourced indigenous, foods, and to me that's, it's turning something that, is very important, very empowering and very powerful and liberating in a sense to more of a personal project when, we're in the context of, colonial oppression and we're facing these ideas and these structures. It's one thing to have a personal project, it's another thing to actually find ways to attack these systems. I'm not saying they're mutually exclusive. So decolonization, it seems to be embraced in the terms where it's like, okay, I'm gonna relearn my language. I'm going to engage in my traditional ceremonies and cultural practices. I'm going to, make traditional clothes and relearn those ways. I'm going to, grow corn and make sure I have these prayers for my well-being and so forth, which is really critically important. And sometimes on a personal and it can be extended to a familial and social level. But the sort of the differentiation in relation, and it's not in opposition to, but it's a differentiation with anti-colonial struggle that I've been, and some of my friends have been trying to assert, including Anthony on some levels, is that anti-colonial, so decolonization can assume that there's still a colonial entity because we're just decolonizing the relationship, but there still is a colonial force. So the tension would be, we want to eliminate, the colonial entity, and what,
and we don't want a relationship.
Precipitates that with the colonizer.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, the colonizer shouldn't exist.
Yeah, exactly. No. It's just, I just wanted to be clear whether that was, because you made a point to actually talk about relationship, which we'll have follow up. Just one thing though.
Well, just to finish that point real quick is that so anti-colonial struggle assumes a position of engaging in attack of colonial structures and ideas to end them, to abolish them. And so decolonization, I think the differentiation to some degrees is that it's a personal project and we want to, end the relationship, even politically on some level. We don't want the colonizer to exist, but the anti-colonial struggle to me is a way to engage in different struggles against oppression within a framework that people can identify, like we can engage in anti-heteropatriarchal struggles and not necessarily have to recognize that as like this, an appropriate decolonial work, because that's what's happening in the U.S. right now. It's just like you'll see a range of anti-oppression or collective liberation analyses that are put forward in this sort of construct of decolonization, but they're not articulating the relationship to indigenous people whose lands are on. So the argument there is, or the analysis there is that no matter how liberated they're going to be against like patriarchy or heteropatriarchy or white supremacy, they're still, if they're still occupying indigenous lands, they're still settler colonizers. And so, to be able to reconcile that is to reconfigure the analysis through an anti-colonial struggle framework and engage in supporting indigenous struggles to their conclusion, which is to liberate the land and the people as well. And so recognizing that the configuration of anti-heteropatriarchy, anti-white supremacy, or anti-capitalist work can be configured through that in support of indigenous people whose lands we're on, so we don't perpetuate settler colonialism or resource colonialism as well.
Do you identify it as a common, so what about other groups though? So for example, I guess you were saying that decolonization is a personal project, but in contemporary understanding, we have obviously, say in British society, the diaspora, you've got obviously South Asian people, you've got black people, you've got many different other people of brown and black identities. Essentially, as a united people, our common enemy is, white supremacy, and people who benefit, and also essentially acknowledging the people who benefit from white supremacy, right? So it's essentially saying that in contemporary understanding, the idea that yes, we can say that there is a very unique kind of struggle that we have, an anti-colonial struggle to attack and abolish those structures. However, what about the idea that identifying our common enemy and fighting sort of with our sort of brothers and sisters who are also oppressed, because we recognize that oppression, obviously we recognize the struggle historically speaking for our indigenous brothers and sisters, and we recognize the same for our black brothers and sisters as well, so how would you kind of address that?
Well, I guess in the part of the argument that, or the assertion is that we're all indigenous people. We're all people of the earth is what indigenous means to someone. In the context of the U.S., I think it's slightly different, and that's where I'm operating from. It's hard for me, and I probably have more questions for you in relation to the context of like Europe, really. And I've studied a bit, history, but I think in terms of what's occurring today, it's quite interesting. But yeah, we should be brothers and sisters in the struggle. In all these struggles to precipitate the end of colonization and capitalism, white supremacy, and heteropatriarchy, as sort of root cause issues. It gets into the question of what is the primary contradiction, or what's the terminal sort of political point, that we can end as or attack as a common source of oppression that will precipitate the liberation of all the land and people and beings in this world. But so from an indigenous perspective, and this is applying my understanding as a Diné person, because when you have these conversations, it's hard not to talk in generalities, or you get into this sort of pan-indigenous perspectives. But the perspective that I bring to it is that there are no laws that can be above nature. That's the basic understanding that we have in our teachings and how we identify ourselves as Diné. And when we identify ourselves, we traditionally, in a ceremonial context as well, we identify as Nohokakti and Diné, which means the holy earth surface people. So we have a responsibility with that identity then to care for and bring balance in this world for future generations and for our well-being and all beings in that. And we maintain that through our ceremonies, through our prayers our sort of our cultural identity is built around that framework of sans honoré, capot jaune is what we say. It's the sort of loose translation is, we maintain health and harmony, and we seek that towards old age, in the future, and to be an elder within health and harmony and balance, and so forth.
It's
and so
good to say, I completely understand that this is the way we kind of heal the sort of violence of colonialism and settlers coming into indigenous land, and the violence that you spoke of earlier today. But even in kind of, the idea that the earth, everyone is indigenous to the earth, is a sound argument, but we're looking at where the indigenous people are, brutalized. We're talking about genocide, we're talking about obviously, a land appropriation, and it's going on today in Palestine and so on. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that let's speak of this in a really sort of in a way where we speak of how we need to regain our rights on our land, as opposed to, because even in India, the colonizers came to India to loot India, cripple us economically and leave us with nothing, and then obviously forced out, so it's like, and when they were forced out, they witnessed the death of millions in the process due to partition and so on as well. So obviously we're talking about the Europeans staying within their own borders and imposing that as well, and that isn't a so-called right-wing argument. That is an argument that we need to hold strongly, because we want the settlers to leave our lands and to return to their own lands, so we may rebuild our infrastructures and reverse the violence done. So this I perceive as decolonization, so I guess there's a similar.
Yeah, so what I was getting to with that comment is that, and to sort of responding to what you're saying, is that, like, typically you need some kind of entity, political entity, to mediate or legislate and enforce rights, and when you identify your relationship to the land, that's unmediated, that's why I was saying that no law can be above nature, is that, we live in relation to each other and to Mother Earth. So, when you talk about no borders, like, I understand it in those terms. We have, our traditional boundaries. We as Diné people have 6 holy mountains, 4 cardinal mountains that represent the pillars that uphold our universe, and we live within those. We don't really live outside of them. And if we do, we have certain prayers, certain ceremonies, and certain things. When we come back, we don't take our sacred mountain soil bundles outside of them. There's a whole bunch of practices that go within that, in that regard. But the sort of point I'm getting to respond to your question, I'm not trying to sidestep it. I'm trying to sort of like step back from the jargon and get into this understanding of how we relate to each other, how we view our relationship to land. And so if you come to our area and we can, have sort of free, prior, informed consent, which I think is a really good standard for understanding how we work together, how we can support each other. And if you're struggling, we see somebody exacting violence on you or your people, categorically, what ways can we support each other to, resist or fight and end this kind of oppression, this kind of mentality
But does that apply to everybody though? Does it apply to the European that is the violent colonizer and the one that benefited from the violence? There's still existing settlers here today that will propagate violence against.
Maybe we should psychologically analyze, like, the European, because is it the European identity through violence? Capitalism only exists in the context of violence. And we talk about these, the power structures and where they come from. Our own people are doing it to us now. They're carrying, forward that same program and reinforcing those structures.
Exactly. So just reinforcing the structures that the colonizers.
Yeah. So
that's what decolonization is.
If we're talking about just like, just getting I don't know what, just taking Europe out and sending it to the moon, or I don't even want to say that because they like the white sort of like fantasies,
No, I mean, I'm not even talking about perpetuating violence at first. I'm talking about the process of reversing the violence. First, education, which is our initiative is education, and then essentially when people recognize that, through education, what the problem is, because many don't recognize, we will know, but not many people, our own people won't know. And so through education they know, and then we uphold that, we uphold our kind of resistance, and sometimes in many parts of the world that is an armed struggle in Palestine, for instance.
Well, that's because, if the question is about educating the violence out of people, I mean, there's some folks who have that power that are going to defend it, especially the ones, at the top of the pyramid, in a simplistic sort of sense, that are never going to relinquish it. So it has to be some kind of struggle that will be met with that kind of violence. But yeah, I mean, I wasn't trying to dodge the question at all. I think it's an important one, but it's part of its roots are definitely in Europe, but I think it's been the process, the science of it, has been refined in different areas, and it's in place. Those same structures, like we could look at Europe as a root of it historically, but I think the global sort of tentacles or the structures of it now are in many places, and it's
every part of our political autonomy.
Part of where the anti-civ analysis comes in, and is very interesting because they see the primary contradiction as civilization, and you can define civilization very interestingly with those, and green anarchist analysis, or I hate the term primitivists, because it's very fucking paternalistic. But yeah, I think it's an important discussion because it gets us to where we need to focus on supporting each other, and where we need to focus our work and attack. Really. So I think it's important. We're focused, sort of situationally in the context of the Diné struggle. We can see where colonization. You can really see the lines of where colonization stops, and where it's still spreading. You can see where capitalism stops and where it's still spreading. And the assimilation is still continuing. But we have elders on our reservation who don't speak English still, who live within what can be considered a traditional economy. I don't like to use the term economy. I like to use the term exploitation matrix, because that's what these systems really are. But they still, there are some elders on our reservation that still just grow corn traditionally, grow traditional crops, raise sheep, some cattle, and live outside of that context. But capitalist expansion and views that as poverty, and attacks it and precipitates violence around that to undermine it so it doesn't exist anymore. And that's the struggle that we have. We can see where it stops and where it's threatening to continue. So we engage in the fight there, but we also engage in the fight, at its sources too, on some level. We can talk about the politics of it, but there's the practical dimensions that are really critical right now, because it's an issue of genocide, and it's clearly an issue of cultural genocide too.
And there needs to be accountability, for that as well. There needs to be a level of, so for instance, there needs to be some form of reparation or some kind of accountability as well.
Yeah, reparations are an interesting question, because we're trying to reconcile, get to a position where we want to exact justice from our oppressors. The only reparations I could see that are reasonable are just having them not exist anymore, and making sure that our ability to live freely, is uninterfered with. I don't know what reparations mean when, if we poison the water, poison the air, poison the land, what reparations can you have except for cleaning that up? It's not monetary to me. It's not about any kind of material value. It's about the ability to make sure that we have a healthy future for the coming generations. It's beyond material on that level, even though that is directly material. But there's no dichotomy between spirit and nature in Diné belief systems. You know, it's really one and the same, and that's how we view our existence with this world, and we operate as well. It's a responsibility and a sacred duty that we have.
Are any tribal leaderships making real claims for land or land redistributions that we as Muslims can elevate? So I guess what he's trying to apply is the approach with respect to Palestine. So Israel is, as we recognize it, illegitimate. So we wish to dismantle it and send the settlers and their descendants back to their home. And you know, so in the US, if all the tribal leaderships are happy with their casinos, then we kind of have to deal with the US as it is, or approach it in a different way, Islamically.
Well, there's some essentialization there, because there's over 565 quote-unquote federally recognized indigenous nations in the U.S. Not all of them have casinos. You know, there are almost 300 or so, 200 plus non-federally recognized indigenous nations that are struggling on different levels. There are many indigenous peoples that don't have casinos, but it's a complex question, because you have to deal with also the legitimacy of the U.S. government in its relationship to indigenous peoples, but you also have to deal with what the tribal councils are. Like, for example, the Navajo Nation, or the Diné people, particularly the Navajo Nation, the Navajo tribal government was established in 1923 by the U.S. federal government with the sole purpose of the tribal council to sign mineral and gas leases, you know, to corporations. I mean, it was to facilitate resource colonialism in our lands. So this tribal council entity, you know, from a traditionalist perspective, is not viewed as legitimate. It's viewed as a colonial force that was constructed, you know, to facilitate resource colonialism. And so what we have to contend with is that dynamic first, internally. I mean, because it's not that, you know, it's very rare that we find a tribal government, you know, the governance of an indigenous nation that is in line with the traditional belief systems. And when it is, it's met with extreme conflict in the U.S. political system, because tribal sovereignty has never truly been defined. I mean, the indigenous nations are more or less domestic dependent nations. So that's, by any definition of sovereignty, that's not sovereign. You know, they're still under the authority of the U.S. government. And so they have a sort of interesting relationship with states, and so gaming, you know, sort of makes things complex. I mean, I tribal gaming, from my position, and I'm just going on a rant here a little bit to some degree, is really just an attempt to force assimilation in really complete capitalist expansion in indigenous communities who've long resisted it, or who have long seen how it's not useful because of our ability to feed ourselves from the land. And so this is
quite beautiful.
Yeah, but I mean, that's the conflict that we have. And so I mean, the argument, and I would extend that conversation to apply to the context of indigenous people in the so-called U.S., in that any support for struggles for self-determination of indigenous people it should be inherently anti-colonial. And I would say it could be decolonial, but I think the terms are shifting today, because in so-called Canada, for example, you have these tribal bands, these tribal government structures that are creating schools. So they're building these schools, and they're calling it an act of decolonization. When it's interesting, because like what's occurring in the schools isn't necessarily teaching anything outside of the same systems and structures of colonial society. So, you know, that's maybe an act of self-determination. They're doing it for themselves with their own resources, but not necessarily an act of liberation. And so, you know, to me, it's important to critically engage in supporting any indigenous liberation struggles wherever they're happening. You know, so if the fight's in Palestine, that's where the fight is, and put your support and resources because it precipitates a crisis against global capitalism or neoliberalism, if you want to call it that. And if we can do that throughout the world, if we can precipitate...
What if there's multiple attacks? So there's an attack on Palestine, there's an attack elsewhere, and imperialism today, imperialism or colonialism, neo-colonialism, has a very sort of different structure. So now you've got proxies, so it's like indirect funding, these proxies, and you've got this in like Syria and things like this. So it's really, how do we kind of address it if there's multiple attacks? And really what the neo-colonialists or the imperialists, whatever term is best, are doing is that they completely crippling us. So they're attacking us in multiple ways where we cease to have any organization.
I don't know if the attack necessitates a lack of organization, or necessarily is like the dynamic, the factor in the lack of organization. I think that there's a range of ways that, state violence, I mean, people use the term criminalization, but I think the state exacts, extreme violence against folks who are fighting back and resisting. So yeah, I mean, it's amazing we get this far. It's, if we look at some of the exceptions, like the Zapatistas, or I mean, we do look to Palestine for amazing inspiration. I mean, even though we recognize that on the ground it's very different, I'm sure it's an extreme struggle on a day-to-day. I've never been there, but I've met folks and engaged in support on different levels. But I want to step back with the question to some degree and recognize that it's to precipitate a crisis against global capitalism or imperialism, and to attack it where it's at, where we engage it. Find different points of intervention where we are, whether it's because if we can look at maybe an example like Peabody Energy, they're one of the largest coal mining companies in the world, transnational global corporation that has sort of invested itself within free market or free trade and neoliberalism on many levels, a benefactor and architect on some levels. They're going bankrupt. So what can we do to precipitate a crisis, or intervene in different fronts to take them down? CAT, I think it's the manufacturer for many of the tractors or the machinery that are bulldozing Palestinian homes, and they operate in the U.S. They operate all over the world. What can we do to engage in conflict, to attack them? And they're one aspect or industry, part of an industry that is a piece to the larger framework. But that's part of it to me, is just looking at the different points of intervention where we can engage and not just sort of romanticize and fetishize and externalize support to where things are sexy. Because for a while the trend was to support Zapatista struggles in Chiapas, which was essential, very important. But at the same time, we had white support, settler support groups that were set up in Arizona, with knowing everything about the Zapatista struggle and nothing about indigenous people whose lands they're occupying, who are fighting, for our lives, fighting for our cultural survival. And so there's something wrong in under those terms. And so for me, that's where the lack of analysis is, because they're saying they're engaging now on these sort of decolonial politics, but fucking no relationship to indigenous people whose lands they're on. So that's what we got to reconcile first, but not just this sort of distancing from whiteness, not operating from a sense of guilt, and sort of exercising the best sense of what we can do to create this
I don't think it's necessarily guilt.
Well, in the U.S. I think it is, but it's
just accountability. It's a term. I think that they need to be educated as much as some of our own people have to be educated, the colonized people. So I think that is just really the emphasis on education.
Is it ignorance then? Ignorance more than guilt?
I mean, it's more kind of recognition of privilege, isn't it? The idea of benefiting from a brutal history, and the fact that they're the so-called first world, and the fact that they recognize where that wealth comes from in the first place, So, sorry.
Well, no, but I think that's an important point, because I like to push going beyond politics of recognition though, and recognizing like your place in relationship of power towards the politics of liberation. Like what can we do to get to that point where it's beyond just like, oh, I have an awareness of this issue and this dynamic and what my privilege is. What can I do to implicate myself in the struggle to attack, and I use that term very, intentionally, attack these ideas and these structures. So that's where, the point I was getting at, is that the sort of dynamic that we see in the U.S. is people are creating like the perfect or the purest ally identity, but ally in relation to the politics and not necessarily implicating themselves beyond on a meaningful basis, and that's where we're sort of pushing. For
I mean,
for
I'm
the
not sure where I
articulation.
stand with the whole ally thing in the first place, to be honest. Whether I even want to wish to engage in that, or whether I'm not too sure about it. But I mean, for example, in our group, we invite them for, to listen and to be educated. But whether we go beyond that is something that we need to obviously consider, if you know what I mean. So we need to think on this. This is a very good discussion that I'm going to pick up on. So in conversation about Black Lives Matter, we spoke about how you're against the appropriation of the term, for example, like Brown Lives Matter or Native Lives Matter. But more so, the notion was mentioned that in fact the indigenous struggle in many ways is fundamentally different from Black Lives Matter. But is there a shared goal, or is there a shared struggle? So what is the end goal of the Native struggle if it's not a reformed society or recognition?
I think there's some great analysis about the appropriation of Black Lives Matters that's already been put forward in relation to just understanding that like Black lives haven't mattered, and that's the problem. We need to address it, and saying Native Lives Matters is just a way that unfortunately is more of co-opting.
Trendy thing.
Yeah, co-opting a hashtag when my perspective is what we're really saying when we say Black Lives Matters, when we say Native Lives Matters and so forth. We're really saying end white supremacy and police violence, in our communities. And so I'd like to get to the point where we're just saying that, and we're actually ending, rather than using hashtags and going beyond sort of keyboard warrior,
jargon,
and so forth. But and I think it's a critical discussion because especially in the context of the U.S. and violence that we face, indigenous lives, have never mattered, and why are we trying to argue as and Black lives have never mattered to the oppressors?
That's
Like
a good point.
why should it be that our lives need to matter?
No, I mean,
to
it's a good point because they've never mattered to them anyway, and it's never mattered in that context.
And it matters to us. So I mean.
Of course it matters.
It's
so we
it's
are
sort of,
arguing to the oppressor. We're arguing
well, it seems to be that
and
part of the interest in recognition is to the oppressor, or to the sort of white identity, in some ways, which I think is problematic. But when it comes down to the indigenous situation regarding police violence, just if you look statistically at the rate or the number per year that indigenous people are murdered, it's higher by cops. It's higher than Black folks based upon ethnicity. And so it's not to say that there's a competition of who's being executed more by cops, but it's just to recognize that we face this problem disproportionately on the same level, but we also have to look at the history of policing, where it comes from, and whose interest it serves as well. But yeah, so I don't want to get too caught up in the discussion about appropriating, hashtags or movements. I think the important work is to say, all right, we need to be standing side by side with each other, supporting each other on the most meaningful basis in our struggles to end white supremacy and police violence in our communities.
Excellent note to end on, and hopefully we can kind of materialize on that. So the sort of fight against white supremacy is definitely a long one. So hopefully we do get to meet again in some, in this life. And thank you so much for joining me and for your time, and really, really appreciate the information that you've given us, and a lot of thought there for me to pick up on in our discussions. Thank you again.
Yeah, I have so many questions for you, so I want to just turn the camera around and interview you. So thank you for your time.
We'll correspond hopefully
Yeah.
in other mediums as well, if not in London in person. But thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thanks again.